with all of the latest developments at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels, connected to your world.
This is CNN.
This hour, the most meaningful progress yet. That is how Turkey is describing the latest talks between Russia and Ukraine. But will they achieve peace? I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. Today's Russia-Ukraine ceasefire talks in Istanbul coming on the same day Russia's defense ministry announced its troops will, quote, drastically reduce military activity around Kyiv and Chernihiv. US officials calling this a major strategy shift by Russia to focus on gains they've made in southern and eastern Ukraine, and warning that Russia could cover the retreat of Kyiv with air and military bombardment. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, negotiators from both sides emerging from those ceasefire talks with positive assessments and a possible way to cool off one of the most contentious issues of this war, the status of Crimea annexed by Russia in 2014. Ukraine saying an agreement is in place to pause hostilities over Crimea for 15 years, pending a final resolution on its status. Russia's lead negotiator calling the talks constructive. An advisor for Ukraine's president saying there is now a chance, at least, that Volodymyr Zelensky and the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, could meet in person. Well, talks aside, there is no relief for the people of Mariupol. President Zelensky saying 90% of the southern port city's residential buildings have been destroyed, and people are having to melt snow water for drinking water. The mayor now calling for a complete evacuation, but Zelensky says Russian troops are blocking all routes in and out of the city. Well, in the last hour, I spoke to the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, and asked her for her reaction to these ceasefire talks. Have a listen.
Well, first of all, we must not forget that these talks are going on because Russia invaded Ukraine and wants to erase Ukraine as a sovereign country. And now the talks are going on, and of course President Zelensky is in a very difficult position because on one hand he sees all the destruction that Russia is causing, all the civilians being killed, but and on the other hand there's this pressure to achieve peace, but he doesn't want to give away his territory, so it's a very, very difficult position. And of course, Russia is struggling, like the previous reporter said, struggling in places in around Kiev, for example. So they are stepping back, but we have to keep in mind that there is still a vast territory that is occupied already with the Russian troops, by the Russian troops. So you know, whatever agreement there is, it is made at gunpoint because the civilians of Ukraine are being killed.
Yeah, it has to be constructive, and I hear what you're saying. It has to be constructive, though, doesn't it, if Ukrainian negotiators are voicing signs of progress as they emerge from today's talks. An advisor for Ukraine's president saying that there is now a chance that Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin could meet in person. Again, your sense, your response to hearing that?
I understand that Ukrainian president wants to do everything that is in his power to stop this war and also stop the killing of civilians and the destruction of the cities of Ukraine. And he's in a very difficult position. So, of course, it is good if two of them meet. So far, President Putin hasn't been or has not agreed to meet Zelensky, as he doesn't consider Ukraine to be a separate country. So he tries to negotiate with bigger players in the world arena, but nobody can make the agreements for Ukraine.
Well, that's the Estonian Prime Minister speaking to me last hour. Our Damon is in Istanbul for us, where these what could be consequential Russian and Ukrainian talks were held. Delegations meeting there earlier. Our, what does this Ukrainian proposal look like?
Well, at this stage, Becky, it seems as if what the Ukrainians are putting to the Russians when it comes to Crimea, for example, is an offer to basically postpone that very controversial issue for another 15 years, or at the very least give both sides this 15-year window during which they are expected to be conducting bilateral talks, during which there will be no military attempt from either side to involve military force when it comes specifically to the issue of Crimea. When it comes to a number of other proposals, well, the Russians have said that they will then be taking that to their own side for further negotiation. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, though, what they need to try to negotiate is not just with Russia. Ukraine also now is in a position where it needs to negotiate these security guarantees that we've been hearing President Zelensky and others talk about, because even though Ukraine is, yes, open to this idea of becoming a non-nuclear neutral state, although they do want to first put that to a referendum, Ukraine is unwilling to do that without these guarantor states being involved. And they would be the likes of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Turkey, to name a few. And what Ukraine wants to see from these guarantor states is an agreement that is similar to, if not more binding than the one that exists among NATO nations themselves. And so Ukraine really right now looking at these various Western nations to pledge, to vow that should Russia attack again once this current round of fighting is over, that these countries would actually step in a concrete way to protect Ukraine from any further hostility. Another thing to talk about too, Becky, even though both sides have been saying that these talks were constructive, even though the Turks have been saying that this is the most progress that has been made during any talk to date, that bar is quite low. If we just look at the issue of humanitarian corridors, both sides talked about a humanitarian ceasefire, Becky, but they didn't even reach an agreement on that.
Sure. I mean, I guess, you know, what we've got here is a Ukrainian proposal forged in Turkey. The ball now very clearly in President Putin's court. I interviewed Ibrahim Kalin, the Turkish presidential spokesperson, ahead of this meeting. I interviewed him on Sunday. You've just seen him in the images there in Turkey. Have a listen to what he told me.
Of course, the negotiating teams are doing an important job, no doubt. It's essential because the Russian side has been saying if the negotiating teams bring us some kind of an agreement, some kind of an understanding, and then, you know, we can have this meeting between the two presidents, because President Zelensky is ready to meet President Putin. It's President Putin who has said no so far, and our president has said, okay, I'm ready to facilitate, bring the two of you together in Turkey or somewhere else. It doesn't matter. You know, we are not trying to promote Turkey as a venue for this. What we are concerned about is to bring an end to this war a day earlier than it is necessary.
He says they're not trying to promote Turkey as a sort of successful venue for this, but if Turkey ends up being that successful venue, you know, what does that mean for Ankara?
Well, look, Turkey has found itself during this conflict, and in fact during other conflicts in the region, playing something of a mediator role, and this most certainly would, to a certain degree, perhaps bolster Turkey's standing, especially when it comes to Western nations with whom it has clashed over a plethora of other issues. But Becky, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, if we just dial it back for a second, because this is not just the ball being in Russia's court. This is also the ball being in a number of Western countries' courts. Those countries that Ukraine wants these security guarantees from. Countries that are the very same countries who right now are unwilling to go, understandably, perhaps to a certain degree, head to head with Russia. And so while right now, yes, we're talking about progress being made at this meeting, there are some very, very tricky to navigate obstacles before we can actually reach a point where an agreement that is suitable to all sides becomes something that is on paper and that can, and perhaps this is one of the more critical points at all, be inked with sufficient faith on both sides that it will actually, this time, be upheld.
Oh, you make a very, very good point. Thank you. It's good to have you on. It's good to have you in Istanbul as this part of what is this horrific story unfolds. Thank you. Word of progress towards that ceasefire. Maybe too little, too late for the decimated port city of Mariupol. Its mayor is calling for a full evacuation of that city. About 160,000 people are said to be trapped there. Let me just repeat that. 160,000 people said to be trapped in the city of Mariupol, many of them relying on melted snow as their only source of water. That is according to the president. Local officials say more than 90% of the residential buildings in the city have been damaged or destroyed. CNN's Phil Black has been hearing from people who have fled Mariupol, and he joins me now live from Lviv, Ukraine. Just describe some of these stories that you have heard, Phil.
Becky, I think the point to remember here, the broader context, is that while Russia is talking about pulling back troops from Kiev and around Chernihiv, two areas where it was already doing really poorly, where its troops had essentially failed in their mission to take those cities quickly, Russia is meanwhile openly pursuing a maximist military strategy in trying to control that eastern territory known as the Donbass. It wants to conquer and control that whole stretch of territory, and that includes the port city of Mariupol, that city where, as we've been talking about for some time now, it's been under siege, where there remains 160,000 or so more people without food, water, with very little heat, and under the risk, the threat of constant military bombardment. Russia is still pushing very hard to take that city in an outright sense, pushing for outright military victory. And day by day, it looks like it's getting closer to that goal. Take a look.
Russia is so close to taking the prize of Mariupol. These soldiers are already celebrating. The flag going up on this local government building is from one of the Russian-backed separatist regions in Ukraine's east. The Ukrainians peeled off, praise the Almighty, this soldier says. The guys are in a good mood, and we are working according to the order of Putin. We get rare glimpses of Russia's efforts to take the city street by street. These soldiers are from the Russian Republic of Chechnya. It's propaganda video from their leader, which CNN has geolocated to Mariupol. Mariupol's mayor, Vadim Boychenko, tells me the fight isn't over.
What happened, or what has happened, to the Ukrainian soldiers defending Mariupol? Are there any left?
They hold the line and they stand to the end, he says, to the last drop of blood. It's not only Ukrainian soldiers trapped here. The city council estimates there are still around 170,000 civilians in this devastated city, and 90% of homes have been damaged or destroyed. Valentina enters what's left of the only home she's ever known, the place where she raised her family. She wasn't here when the shell hit. She's been hiding in the basement. She doesn't want to leave. She knows she can't stay. But many will never leave. The council says almost 5,000 people have been killed during the 4-week siege, including more than 200 children. Russia is so close to taking its prize, but it will be a blackened shell of a city, and it's unlikely the people they're conquering will ever forgive them.
So, Becky, Russia says, the Ukrainian forces say they're maintaining this circular defense in the city of Mariupol. Circular because they are surrounded. It looks increasingly difficult to see how the fall of Mariupol can be prevented. Remember, in the context of these peace talks, Ukraine says there is no way that it will accept Russian control of the Donbass, and yet there is no reason to believe Russia is going to be prepared to give up this territory, which it is still in the process of taking. It is likely to be the ultimate sticking point in any future peace talk efforts. Becky.
Yeah, unless we forget those on the ground who are suffering. Phil, thank you. Well, while those civilians, those thousands of civilians, are still trapped inside Mariupol, some are managing to make their escape from the artillery attacks and rockets raining down on their homes. But even their temporary safe haven may not be so safe. That story is coming up. Plus, the head of UNICEF joins us to talk about the tough road ahead for Ukraine's kids. We'll look at how the war is affecting so many children.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Mainland China tolerates no signs of dissent whatsoever.
Are you anticipating dozens of people being prosecuted? Hundreds? Thousands?
Stories of mass internment camps have been trickling out.
Do you think you'll see your husband again?
This period of mourning is taking place in a real climate of fear. The humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in front of our eyes here.
This is one of the cells? Come on in here.
We're flying over ISIS front lines. This is the only protection we have. The nerves are still very much on edge. Firefighters have been battling this blaze for weeks.
What do you say to people who question climate change?
We need to do something now.
Ivan Watson, CNN.
In a special ongoing season of the Tug of War podcast, CNN reporters are on the ground in Ukraine, documenting Russia's invasion, the escalating conflict, and what it means for the rest of the world. Tug of War. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
A fact for you. A child in Ukraine has become a refugee almost every single second. That's since the war began just more than a month ago. Those figures according to UNICEF. That means more than half of Ukraine's children have been displaced, roughly 4.3 million of them. Well, the head of UNICEF, Catherine Russell, says it's been one of the fastest displacements of children since World War II. Nearly 2 million of those kids have fled Ukraine and have crossed into neighbouring countries. For those who remain, getting out of cities like Mariupol is getting more dangerous by the day. CNN's Ivan Watson spoke with residents who have made it out of that southern port city but are unsure of their next move.
Shattered by Russian artillery, the windshield of a car that a Ukrainian family used to make their two-day escape from the besieged port city of Mariupol. We meet Natalia shortly after her family reaches relative safety in the parking lot of a superstore on the edge of the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. The day before yesterday, an artillery shell hit our house, she says. Half of the house is gone. This is what was left.
If Russia sees this, I want them to know that they aren't defending us. They are killing us because they seem to think they're defending us, and that's just not true.
This parking lot, an unofficial gateway to Ukrainian-controlled territory for more than 70,000 Ukrainians who officials say fled Mariupol. The evacuees look shell-shocked. They arrive in vehicles draped with white rags and signs that say children, and some, like 4-year-old Alisa Isayeva, show up in yellow school buses. They were bombing us, she says. Bombing us with planes and tanks. Alisa's aunt Lilia says she suffered from a concussion for days after a strike hit her home.
We walked among corpses. There were bodies under the evergreens. Soldiers without heads, without arms. They're lying there. Nobody is gathering them. There was such fear that I felt like I was underwater. I wanted to wake up, and now I'm here, and this feels like some kind of a dream.
Inside the superstore, volunteers and the city government are trying to help.
Newly arrived evacuees are welcomed at this support center where they're offered warm meals, access to medics, and information about how to travel deeper into safer parts of Ukrainian territory. There's also a bulletin board here where some people are offering free repair of shattered car windows. And there are also postings here looking for information about missing loved ones. For some who survived Russia's modern-day siege, this is the first hint of safety they've had in weeks. Outside, Yulia Mishodova and her son Stanislav have just arrived.
And bear!
Stanislav is chatty and upbeat, but his mother appears unsteady. When Russian warplanes bombed, she says, the family hid under the dining room table, surrounded by pillows.
When the plane flew past, we were sheltering in the center of town. Until now, my ear still hurts from the shockwave.
The unlikely safe haven provided in this parking lot is precarious. Ukrainian officials say Russian troops are positioned barely a half-hour's drive away from here. Ivan Watson, CNN, Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine.
Catherine Russell is the head of UNICEF, and she visited refugees on the Romanian border earlier this month. This is her. She's seen up close what Ukrainian families, women and kids, mostly, it has to be said, face once they enter a new country and try and get adjusted. And she joins me here, I'm delighted to say, in Dubai. You do not have to be a mum to feel the pain of what so many of these families are going through. It certainly helps, though. I mean, it certainly hits home when you are a mum. You were recently at a shelter at the border, as I said, between Ukraine and Romania. Just describe for our viewers what you saw and heard during your trip.
Yeah, well, you can see it on their faces, Becky. I mean, the mothers were confused. They're exhausted because they traveled, often by train, sometimes by car to the border. You know, they're frequently carrying their babies, like you saw, or their children have them by the hand. The children are, dragging their little suitcases behind them. It's just terrifying for them. They're bewildered, they're uncertain, and really they don't know what's coming next. And I think, the challenging thing is a lot of times they've left behind, almost always, their father, their husband, and they're scared and they're worried about the future. The interesting thing is, when I talked to them, they all talked about how they thought they were going home in a few days, and unfortunately we know that's not true.
How does the conflict and the massive displacement impact kids, specifically both in the short, but I'm interested in the long term here as well. What's being done and what more can be done to help them through this process?
Well, in part it depends where they go and what happens to them. And many children are very resilient, so that's the good news. And children can get past things, but they need help. They need social services for that. The children here are going to countries like Poland, Romania, and a lot of them are moving on to other countries in Europe, Germany and other places. But there are a lot of uncertainties for them. Right now they're moving, a lot of them are staying with families in other places. Individuals are taking them in. We don't know how long that's going to last.
And it makes them very vulnerable.
It does, and we're very worried about that because we have a lot of unaccompanied children who are going. We have people on the border who are trying to intercept them and make sure that they don't get picked up by people who are not well-meaning, and there unfortunately are those people who prey on children or young people. And we see a lot of that, unfortunately. And these children are very vulnerable, and we have to be very, very conscious of that and looking out for them.
We're talking about those who have fled the conflict. Of course, you know, we can, again, not just only imagine, our reporters are telling the stories of those, of course, who have been left behind. Aid agencies have said that though there has been a huge outpouring of support for Ukraine, they are still not getting enough funds, the funds necessary to address the humanitarian needs of this crisis. Is that the case with UNICEF?
Yes, I mean, people have been very, very generous, but the needs are immense. That's the problem. They're just extraordinary to try to take care of the people who've left the country, for sure, and then also the people who are still in the country. I mean, we're estimating right now that half the children in Ukraine have left their homes. So yes, 2 million have left the country, but 2.5 million have left their homes in the country and still need services. And you've shown some of them on your videos. I mean, these children are really at a loss and don't know what comes next. And we're trying to provide education services and health services. And
I was going to ask you, what are the funds spent on? I mean, what sort of money are we talking about here?
We're talking about many millions and millions of dollars. And our sort of request was for, I think, $300 million, but we will definitely spend at least that. And I think it also depends how long this goes on. And I unfortunately don't see any end in sight.
And of course, unfortunately, we hear the warnings that with the world's focus on the war in Ukraine, and that is understandable, we are neglecting a number of other critical issues, global crises. What does the worldwide attention on Ukraine mean for these other major humanitarian challenges? This show is based in this region. It reports in and from and on this region. We are well aware as a team just how other issues can get left behind. And there is a sense of double standards to a certain extent. I mean that in the best possible way.
Yes, of course. Well, for UNICEF, we continue our work in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Syria, in the Horn of Africa. I mean, there are so many places where children are in desperate need, and we continue to do our work there. But there's no question that the resources are harder to come by in those regions. It's in a sense, the world's attention shifts, right? Sometimes it's on Afghanistan and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's on Syria, sometimes it's not. Right now it's on Ukraine, and as you say, that's understandable. But we need to make sure that children everywhere are being taken care of. And that's hard to do, but we need to do it. As a world community, we can't forget the children who are suffering in all parts of the world.
You have amazing teams working around the world. We work with many of them sadly, on these conflicts and these issues. We will continue to provide support for you and do whatever we can, because
Thank you so much.
These kids need that support. Thank you very much indeed for joining me here.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you.
Well, with so many lives at stake, it is no wonder that Joe Biden's unscripted comment about Vladimir Putin set the world on edge. Ahead, analysis from my colleague Stephen Collinson about how his words could change the course of this war. That is coming up.
Egypt is transitioning towards a sustainable, circular economy. Through the opening of the Gabal Al Asfar wastewater treatment plant, it is using treated water to irrigate agricultural land and is producing organic fertilizers. The plant has been designed to reduce waste and optimizes the use of water resources. It generates electricity and saves carbon emissions, ensuring that over 8 million people across the country live better, healthier lives.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
You can help the refugees from Ukraine.
Join the over 70,000 who've already raised millions for food, shelter, and more. Explore CNN.com/impact. Click to take action.
I'm Bill Weir in Greenland, and this is CNN.
Returning to our top story, a significant announcement from Moscow following talks with Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry saying its troops will, quote, drastically reduce military activity around the capital of Kyiv and Chernihiv to the north. US officials say this marks a major shift in strategy. Russia making clear after the talks this is not a ceasefire, but a gradual military de-escalation. Meantime, Ukrainian forces pressing a counter-offensive in parts of the capital. The Interior Ministry says the suburb of Irpin, which Ukraine claimed to have retaken, came under shelling on Monday night. You can see the damage the city had already sustained in fighting from video taken earlier this month. Well, the situation is so fast-moving and so delicate that any sudden moves are likely to make the whole world nervous. Ukraine's fuel for this fight has been the billions of dollars in military aid from the US and other NATO allies who are trying to avoid fighting Russia directly, which is why what the US president said about Vladimir Putin on Saturday, quote, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power," set nearly everyone on edge. On Monday, the American president clarified what he says he meant.
I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing in the actions of this man. Just brutality. Half the children in Ukraine. I just come from being with those families. But I want to make it clear, I wasn't then, nor am I now, articulating a policy change. I was expressing the moral outrage that I feel.
Well, that was the US president on Monday. CNN's Stephen Collinson calls it a present for Russia's president. He writes, "There's no doubt that Biden handed Putin a propaganda gift that could undermine the US president's own hard work in keeping the focus on Ukraine. Moscow's information complex is certain to present the war to the Russian people as a hostile push by the West in order to further obscure the truth about the unprovoked attack on Ukraine." Well, CNN Politics' senior reporter Stephen Collinson joining me live from Washington now. And it was Biden himself who has always cautioned that a president's words must be carefully chosen. I guess that begs the question, was this an off-the-cuff remark, or were these words chosen by President Putin?
Hey, Becky, I think there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, throughout his long political career, words have had a habit of getting President Biden into trouble. He had a long reputation as a bit of a gaffe machine during his almost half-century in the Senate. Way back in 1988, he had to pull out of a presidential campaign because he plagiarized the words of then British Labour leader Neil Kinnock. So this is not a new thing. He did impose more discipline on himself, and he's talked about that himself during the campaign in 2020. That was helped by the fact that he wasn't out that much because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you have Biden's difficulty in making himself clear. He's also a politician who wears his heart upon his sleeve. He did see those refugees and he was emotionally affected. And he does have this streak of indiscipline. So when you put those two things together, that's one thing. But you're right, it's very important during an international crisis, especially one between two nuclear-armed superpowers, that the president speaks very carefully. That was one reason why the White House tried to clear this up very quickly on Saturday. The problem was that they actually made the problem worse, because it was clear from what they said that they were trying to say, well, the president was talking about Putin not being able to have power over Ukraine and other countries. You know, it was completely ridiculous. It was clear what the president said. I think he got to a point yesterday when he said on camera, look, I don't think Putin should be in power, but I'm not going to take any steps to take him down, which was probably what the White House should have come up with back on Saturday. And it might have, you know, changed this whole situation of international alarm we saw unfolding. I do think this was probably more of an issue outside the United States, where people were struggling to work out exactly what Biden was saying, rather than in the United States.
And you make a good point, because as somebody who is outside of the United States, I have heard that concern voiced again and again, and the confusion that was caused. And to avoid any confusion, by the way, that I might have caused, I clearly meant Biden when I said Putin, leading into the question to you. But well done for not being confused. I think it was pretty clear. I was moderating a panel at the World Government Summit here in Dubai today, Stephen. I want you to have a listen to what economist Pippa Malmgren said.
Otto von Bismarck said, "The art of diplomacy is about giving others ladders to climb down from untenable positions." And I fear that the current position of the United States is very much, we can win this, as opposed to, we need to find an off-ramp. We need to find an exit. We need to get back to a negotiating table. We may have disagreements, but resolving them in a battlefield is not the right way to do it. And
that speaks to the very point that you were just raising. What is the sense at the White House as to what this might have caused? I know they've walked it back, and we've heard from Joe Biden himself, but what's the sense behind the scenes about the impact?
I think they realize that this is a very delicate situation, and you do not want to make this a public showdown between Biden and Putin, to make it even more difficult for the Russian leader to make concessions, if he were willing to make them, to step back away from this. And they've been very careful. That whole episode about not sending Polish jets, Soviet-era fighters to Ukraine, they were trying to make sure that this didn't become a NATO against Russia issue rather than a Russia-Ukraine issue. But at the same time, and there's these, perhaps these peace talks are showing some developments in Turkey, there's a real concern in Washington that allowing President Putin to bite off another huge chunk of Ukraine in the greater Donbass region, for example, which seems to be the way the Russians are heading, that would reward his aggression. So while we may be seeing a de-escalation, I think it's unlikely that the US is going to step back from its tough position against Moscow. The sanctions, very considerable support for Ukraine at this point. And one more thing is, you know, this idea that the president might have convinced Putin that the US was out to get him. I think there's a lot of evidence that the Russian leader thinks the US has been trying to get rid of him for more than a decade. He thought Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, was sponsoring demonstrations in Moscow against him. So at this point, I think his view of the United States and his suspicion of the United States is such that anything that you know, President Biden says is unlikely to change what is a really jaundiced view of America in President Putin's mind, and to change his behavior.
Stephen Collinson's in the House. You also wrote in your piece, and I quote here, Biden's initial efforts to avoid personalizing the conflict with Putin and characterizing the war as a direct US-Russia showdown have been undermined by his own hardening rhetoric towards the Russian leader in recent days. You can find Stephen's excellent analysis at CNN.com. Stephen, thank you. Coming up, how the advisor to the UAE president sees the conflict in Ukraine and the geopolitical changes in the Middle East, plus Turkey's role in the Russia-Ukraine talks. I've been speaking to the chief advisor to the Turkish president. His take, along with the diplomatic view from Brussels. All that is up next.
Being a chef in Slovenia is really nice. Having a lot of forests, having a lot of green places. Our philosophy of getting products in the restaurant is very simple. In the beginning, when we start to develop a dish, we check our gardens. What does it grow there? We check what is growing in the forest. Picking stuff from the nature, it's very important for us, for each chef, not to lose this feeling of how your products comes to the table. I think for the future it's very important that all the restaurants are starting to focus more into the green way of working. We want to encourage people all the time to buy local, to buy seasonal, to have all the information they need to be satisfied.
And Becky Anderson in Dubai, welcome back. You are watching Connect the World. It is 20 to 8 here in Dubai as we continue our coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I want to get you first up to speed on some of the other stories that are on our radar right now. And British police say they will issue 20 fines as part of their investigation into the Partygate scandal involving Boris Johnson's government. It's the first official confirmation that illegal events were held at Downing Street and Whitehall at the height of the pandemic. A spokesman for the UK Prime Minister says Mr. Johnson has so far not been issued a fine. Shanghai city officials clamping down even more as they enforce a two-phase COVID lockdown to get everybody there tested. 6 million people living in Pudong district are no longer allowed to leave their homes except to get that mandatory COVID test. Before, they were restricted but to their residential compounds. Oil prices have fallen sharply after Russia indicated it plans to dial back its assault on parts of Ukraine. That's easing energy supply fears, which had, of course, sent crude prices soaring earlier this month. And US Secretary of State Antony Blinken on a two-day visit to Morocco. Here he is during a meeting with the Moroccan foreign minister. Later, he is set to meet the UAE's de facto leader, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, at his local palace. Well, that meeting between Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince and the US Secretary of State is an important one. As a regular viewer of this show, you will know that we have been monitoring a new regional dynamic emerge since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps its momentum has increased. It's in fact been going on for some time, one in which regional countries like the UAE are taking on a more nuanced position vis-à-vis their relations between Moscow and Washington. In a nutshell, regional powers are sensing a need to chart their own foreign policy path, and that was on display at a recent meeting of Arab foreign ministers in Israel. Well, earlier I spoke to the UAE's presidential advisor, Anwar Gabash, and I asked him about that Negev Desert Summit, as it is being known. Have a listen.
And the Middle East really, going back to the Najaf summit, the Middle East is not really only about Iran, and the Middle East is not only about Israel.
Because you could be confused by that.
Yeah, you could be confused. You could be confused, and I think our whole intention is to find a way of functionally working with Iran.
Anwar Gargash had this to say on the impact of that war in Ukraine on the international system. Have a listen.
Ukraine is going to be a significant change in the international order. And I think the repercussions are going to be quite deep and prolonged. But I think we do really need to find a political solution, and it starts with a ceasefire and a political solution ASAP. We need to do that because the danger of horizontal or vertical escalation is real.
Anwar Gargash speaking to me earlier here at the World Government Summit. Well, the most meaningful progress yet, that is what Turkey is saying about those face-to-face Russia-Ukraine talks held a short time ago in Istanbul. The Kremlin is now saying it will, quote, drastically reduce its military assault on the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv and the northern city of Chernihiv. Some US officials going so far as to call this a major strategy shift by Moscow. The US president has been on the phone with European leaders today discussing the latest developments. CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is live from Brussels. So let's drill down on where we are on all of this. What do we know about the detail of this Ukrainian proposal, Nick? And how is it being received? We know that there is a ball in Putin's court, of course, because the next stage is for face-to-face talks. But as we understand it, this proposal will have a real impact on a number of European countries. Explain.
This at the moment is, as you say, a proposal from the Ukrainian side, and the only feedback we have from the Russian side to say is that there's 2 points here. One, and you've just mentioned both of them, but this is the current Russian position, that there's a potential now for a meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky, and the Russians have decided to dial back their offensive around Kyiv and Chernihiv. Now, these steps in themselves, even the Russians admit this dialing back their offensive there doesn't mean that it's a ceasefire. The ball is firmly in the Russian court, and it really is going to depend on how Russia responds to how the EU, for example, can respond. But I think just to give you a flavour of the sentiment, as you said, President Biden speaking with the Prime Minister of Italy, Chancellor of Germany, President of France, a British Prime Minister as well, speaking with them in the past hour or so. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying that really not seeing any momentum on the Russian side yet to convince them that the Russian side is genuine. So that really does mean we have to see what Russia does with this ball that's now in their court. And I think the other thing you can take away from today is the fact that, for example, Ireland has expelled 4 Russian diplomats. The Netherlands has expelled 17 Russian diplomats. Belgium today expelling 20 Russian diplomats. The French sports company Decathlon deciding to close its outlets in Russia. All of these signals coming from the European Union tell you that the tough line that's being taken with Russia, the sanctions that are being taken with Russia, is maintained. You can expect that to have been part of President Biden's call with these leaders as well. That this is only a proposal from the Ukrainian side. We have to see how far Russia is going to go with it. And I think the big difficulty that everyone sees is that while Russia says it's easing off the conflict in some parts of Ukraine, it's maintaining the conflict in other parts. And of course, part of the Ukrainian position is Russia must remove all its troops to pre-invasion positions outside of Ukraine, the 23rd of February. So I think that's the lie of the land at the moment. But the position from here is just as it was yesterday. There's a lack of trust in Russia, and it needs to be seen how they will respond.
On the issue of neutrality, of course, it will require a Ukrainian referendum, as NATO membership is part of its constitution. That wouldn't happen anytime soon, would it? Given just the state of affairs in Ukraine at present.
It's exactly that conundrum. You know, what we've seen today in Istanbul sounds good, and it looks like a potential map of where things could go, and the Crimea issue, which is hugely contentious, parked for 15 years. But if Russia insists on keeping its forces inside Ukraine, then a referendum becomes a non-starter as far as the Ukrainian government's concerned. They say you can only have a referendum when people feel free to go and vote. How could the people of Kherson, which has now been taken over by Russian military, or many of the other smaller cities, how could those people feel free to go and express their opinions where they're having a new parallel government inflicted upon them? People are being detained there. There's been, you know, a push to for those Ukrainians in those Russian-held places now to use the Ukrainian currency. How could those people feel free and able to go and express their will in a referendum? And that's the Ukrainian position. The Russian troops have to be out before you can have a referendum. So the troop issue is contentious. The referendum couldn't happen till afterwards. It could be potentially a year. Who knows how long, Becky?
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that he has seen no signs the talk between Ukraine and Russia are moving forward in an effective way because the US has not seen, and I quote him here, signs of real seriousness by Russia. So the position from the US Secretary of State, Nick, as you will have heard today, actions speak louder than words. To be continued, as it were. Thank you, Nick. Still to come. The fallout from the fight, what Will Smith now says about the slap seen around the world. Plus, for the first time in months, Queen Elizabeth II steps out in public at an event to honour her late husband. Details on the service for Prince Philip is after this.
When you dream more, you need to move more. With over 45% of sub-Saharan Africa using mobile money, innovative digital payment solutions are giving people financial freedom. Access FacePay uses AI to make transactions more secure and accessible for over 31 million customers. Access. More than banking.
Will Smith has posted an apology for slapping Chris Rock at Sunday's Academy Awards ceremony. On Instagram, Smith wrote, and I quote him here, "Violence in all forms is poisonous and destructive." He says his behaviour was unacceptable and inexcusable. The Academy has opened a formal review into Smith's actions. And it looks like more people than expected were watching the Academy Awards on Sunday night, according to early Nielsen numbers. That's the organisation that tracks viewing figures. The show drew an average of 15.3 million viewers in the States. That's a 56% jump from last year's show. That was the lowest rated Oscars ever. It's not clear yet if there was a surge in viewership after Will Smith slapped Chris Rock or before, but the altercation blew up on social media, which may have drawn some people to tune in for the show's final hour. Well, Britain's Queen Elizabeth II makes her first public appearance in months to pay tribute to her late husband of 73 years. Members of the royal family and world dignitaries attended a Thanksgiving service honouring the Duke of Edinburgh, as he was also known as, who passed away last April. CNN's Anna Stewart has more from London for you.
This was the first time the Queen has been seen outside of a royal